Mr. President, dear colleagues, good to be with you this morning. And it's always difficult to come at the end of a meeting when so many things have happened since the beginning of the meeting and you don't know exactly where the audience is and what you want to hear. But I thought I offer today some reflections on where GESDA is and where I see that GESDA could further develop in the future. But before doing that, let me just come back to a personal experience. I have been, as you heard from my CV, a Swiss diplomat, and as a Swiss diplomat, we have basically been educated in the fact that with a country with no significant natural resources, investment in science and technology is basically what we need to do. And diplomacy for us has always been diplomacy for science, to create space so that science could develop, and was always also tapping diplomacy into knowledge and experience coming from science and to bring it to fruition also in the diplomatic space. So, given this presupposition, GESDA was kind of an important adventure to embark on. And as a president of ICRC, I have learned how important it is if you want to be a credible, neutral, impartial, and independent operator in areas of conflict and close to front lines, you needed to tap into the best possible evidence-based activities that you could. And therefore, advice on law, policy, and operational activity would be absolutely critical in order to heighten your credibility as a neutral and impartial operator. And then also I saw over the last couple of years in particular how leveraging science and technology for good, for those who are disadvantaged and disenfranchised in conflict regions, was absolutely essential to our mandate. But of course, as a diplomat, I will focus today a little bit more on the D aspect of GESDA. Now, because of my job, I ask myself how diplomacy could be a better tool to shape a cooperative international environment. And I was encouraged over the last couple of days to see these discussions here, advancing on capacity building for science diplomacy. It has been mentioned. And it's not only about science diplomacy, also capacity building in many other areas. We have advanced considerably over the last years to develop GESDA, and advancing has also heightened and sharpened our consciousness that there are dilemmas that we have to keep on our radar screen if we move forward. And I just mentioned three. We want to engage on scientific freedom. And at the same time, we want the functionality of science. We want results from science. That's a tension. There is not self-evident that scientific freedom will lead to functionality. And it's not so evident how we will manage this as we move forward. We have also to balance the right to science. It was discussed in an in-depth discussion yesterday with the logic of intellectual property. And we know the arguments back and forth, but I think GESDA will have to be conscious that there is tensions here which we'll have to address and manage as we move forward. And we see science in institutions, structures, processes, credit lines, the very institutional part of science, which to a large extent is represented here. And we know that in society as well as in science, there is a world outside which is not yet part of the GESDA enterprise. It's not only about opening up to civil society, and I'm very encouraged that this morning we have this meeting on youth, which really shows that there is development also in enlarging the scope and the audience of GESDA. But we will also have to be conscious and to be alert that science is not only delivered in scientific institutions. It's also the common sense of communities. It's also scientists outside the traditional institutions which we will have to look at. But let me just mention to you 6 brief points where I consider GESDA will have to be conscious and will have to discuss as we move forward. First, on diplomacy. I have to tell you that whenever I discussed GESDA over the last 2 years, I'm sometimes concerned, not so much in the audience I see here, but in some other audience, of still a relatively conservative interpretation what diplomacy today is. Diplomacy outside of this enterprise is always understood as diplomacy of states which somehow at certain moments meet to find multilateral consensus amongst states. And I think this is very much far away from where I think diplomacy should be. I'm very conscious also that it is far away from where GESDA thinks that diplomacy should be. And I think it's important that diplomacy 2, 3, or 4.0, wherever you count, has to be something different. It has to be built on transnational, multiple societal actors and constituency, state and non-state, heavily influenced and taking recognition of the digital transformation that we are encountering. Diplomacy increasingly is characterized by fragmented interest encompassing much more than political and security issues, but rather in need to be in service of economic, financial, environmental, and other social aspirations. And I think it is critically important that we defend in the development of GESDA a concept of diplomacy which is not only state-based, but is a whole of society aspect of diplomacy on which we want to build. Secondly, it strikes me when I think about science, and I briefly mentioned it at the very beginning, that still this whole room here and everybody here present, if I have well seen, and in particular the speakers, are presented to the outside world as affiliated to an organization. I'm here as former president of ICRC, not as Peter Maurer, and everybody who is in here has an affiliation, an institutional affiliation. And I think there is a danger that when we only think about institutional affiliations, that we forget about what makes science and diplomacy both move. It's beyond institution structure, processes, and representation. It's about professional networks, transcending institutions, and it's about communities of practice. It's about local communities. It's about youth and other constituencies of societies. And I think it is important that we take into consideration this aspect as we move forward. One book that has influenced me a lot over the last couple of years is really the work of Etienne and Beverly Wenger-Trainer, who have worked on communities of practice. And I think it is important that communities of practice, as they are working on finding responses to challenges of societies, are not necessarily institutionalized, neither in science nor in diplomacy. And I think it is important to have this concept of horizontal organization again, of network, of communities, and how they function. And GESDA will have to find a way to include those communities of practice as we move forward, because from communities of practice comes as much innovation as comes from top-notch scientific organization. Thirdly, we all know, and it has been discussed over the last couple of days, that we are once again in a divided world. Deglobalization, power block building is affecting all our lives, and the international cooperation first and foremost. Political divides entering different professions and communities. Scientists themselves have become vectors of divides because under the responsibility that scientists see for themselves in society, they have also become part of the debates in societies and therefore part of the divisions in societies. And I think it's important to take as an objective that GESDA, as we move forward, has to go back to this essential truth which has always kept science beyond political divides. The proof of the pudding will be whether GESDA manages to become and to create and recreate that space for discussion, including those who are not participating in the discussion today, because in terms of global political divides, they are not interested, not coming, they are sanctioned, they are excluded. And at the level of science, this can only be a fruitful exercise if we really stick to this ambition of science over hundreds of years as it has developed as a connector of people who can basically be an incubator of societal consensus and not a divider of societal consensus. And scientists can spearhead this movement. Realistically speaking, in today's geopolitical landscape, GESDA will not be able to limit itself on leveraging science for good. GESDA now enters what I call déformation professionnelle, the humanitarian dilemma. Having to mitigate the impact of short-term bad, because everybody has complained about the short-term bad and the crises and the divisions in which we are, and see how we can gather energy for the long-term good. And this is absolutely essential as we look at the global political divides. The future of warfare is a case in point, as it is unfolding in front of us much more earlier than 2 years ago we would have expected the future of warfare coming to us. When I look at what the battlefield reality in today's modernized conflict, in particular in Ukraine, are, then it is really what we described as science fiction 2 years ago. It's battlefields expanding to space and cyberspace and into the cognitive space. It's weapons which are digitally enhanced and loaded with artificial intelligence. It's civilians neglected, data militarized, military strategies supported by cyberspace, space-based intelligence, and command actors heavily fragmented and operating in the dark. This is a new environment in conflict areas, and it is important that we take into consideration what we can do as a diplomatic and science community in order to create and recreate a space again, to see what kind of norms and principles can be applied in this new environment of modern warfare. What are the ethical guidelines helping to navigate those deep dilemmas in which we are? What is the behavioral science to mobilize so that we can capture what is going on? But I wanted to give a sense here that my impression is we have been overtaken by speed, and what was science fiction 2 years ago is already reality today, and therefore it's much more urgent than the social science dimension of GESDA, which Marie Lorsal has, in her introduction Wednesday, highlighted that this issue becomes of critical importance to the development of GESDA. Fourthly, let me just mention very briefly, we are, of course, confronted today with the conundrum of complexity. We have seen over the last couple of years the complexity of climate change, the pandemic, governance issues, long-time poverty, violence in societies, producing what I would call a conundrum of complexity, fragmentation of actors, uncertainty, instability, speed, and unforeseeability. And if this is the environment in which we are, we will have to get our head around how we can find some elements of stability in a world which is deeply unstable. What strikes me most is that the foreseeability that is underlying the basic notion of GESDA is becoming precarious, because the dynamics of multiple crises leads us with unforeseeability. So I do recognize, and I am the first one to appreciate, the effort of GESDA of foresight. But I wanted just to inject a notion of caution that when I look at what I have experienced over the last couple of years, it has defied foresight. And it's to be prepared to the unprepared, which is still important when we look forward. Fifthly, let me just again throw at you, and it's very personal and subjective, but I have made a tour over the last 2 days here and listening to many of the conversations. And I have been deeply encouraged to encounter some concepts which I find highly promising in view of what I have described as a complex world. I find it really interesting. I have mentioned to consider science as a connector of people and society transcending political divides. I have found it important to look at fragility and resilience building and sustainable ecosystem and complex value chains, which are all notions I picked up in the discussion. I find it important to recognize professionalism as a complement to also the political divides and issues that we are looking at. I find Amandep Singh's remark at the beginning of this conference very remarkable when he said that scientists and those who are associated at GESDA must have upstream political engagement. We can't just remain in our casier and in our closed shops. We need to engage politically and to go to the public space. I found interesting the use of scientific method to make us think about the future of life, which is sometimes not linear, but also is unforeseeable, as I mentioned. I was intrigued by all the discussions on trust, not only trust between humans, but trust over data, trust in privacy, trust in relationship and how we build it. I think it's a promising concept to further develop. And I was very intrigued by what Peter Brabeck said at the beginning, that this should not become and be only a coalition of the willing, but a coalition of the world. And then finally, let me make a remark on governance. While everybody talks about today's insecurities, it's still critically important to start looking at key governance challenges for the future. I would agree, though, that changing realities by the day are not the best basis to find solid thinking on norms, institutions, platforms, processes, which will govern the future. And still, it is now that we need to ask ourselves what resilient governance would look like, how to make decision-making processes more inclusive, how to overcome divides, and while doing so, how to leverage technology. Diplomacy has a key role in designing governance for science and technology, which are more adequate to the challenges that we all see today. You have heard more explicitly and between the line that I have taken some freedom of speech of the retired president to share with you some doubts that I have on a too much or a too big focus on institutions instead of governance as system building. I see a point of focusing some of the discussions rather on networks, platforms, ecosystems, and issue government rather than institutions. Also, it may be useful even to nuance the concept of solution, which has a static meaning for most people, and in a hyper-dynamic world may not be the adequate word that we are really envisaging at GESDA. Maybe this is the moment to give more credit to good old scientific practice and value experiment, experimentation, testing hypotheses, running lessons learned and peer review processes, and find gradual pathways for improvement of society which might be more realistic than just envisaging a solution in an institution. This might be a little bit too much of making the patient in charge of the hospital. And I think it's important that we learn from Confucius or Buddhism that the path is the goal. And I think with those few words, I wanted to conclude. Thanks a lot.